Hey, everybody. We're going to start out this episode a little bit different and put our dumb and private up front now. The reason that we're doing that is because the last 10 to 15 minutes of our recording this week, Duffy's mic died and we didn't know. So we kept recording. And so it's just a little amazing little video of myself just talking to myself, and it's actually pretty hilarious, and I'm going to try to find the cut and share it on Instagram. But just wanted to let you guys know we had a couple of technical difficulties in this episode, but it ultimately is the theme of our dumb and private. So with that, enjoy the episode.
5, 6, 7, 8.
That's a quick one.
I know. I was thinking about it today, and I was like, oh, I'm tired of doing 5, 6, 7, 8. Like, maybe I'm gonna stop.
I feel like the people want what they want, Katie Boyson.
Okay. Oh God. Somebody tell me to stop.
Right in. Please give Katie Boyson a break from her 5, 6, 7, 8. Maybe I'll take over the mantle. You never know.
Oh my God. If you 5, 6, 7, 8 into anything, I would be over the moon.
Yeah, I've never done that in my entire life, but
no, it's not on brand for you.
It's not. It's not.
But for us together, very on brand. Everyone, welcome to the Smart in Public podcast. This is a podcast that discusses business, careers, and life through the eyes of public relations and comms experts. I'm Katie Boyson.
And I'm Katie Duffy.
So today we wanted to dive into a case study just because there's been a lot of swirling. Not sure if you guys are familiar with what's happening with Intuit and the Verge and everything that's happened there, but we thought it brought out a bigger theme of executive prep and expectation setting and all that good stuff. So maybe Duffy, why don't you introduce us, like what happened? What's the scenario? What's the rundown?
Yeah. So I think probably a lot of comms people have probably seen it. But if you haven't, I'll give you the sort of 411 of what happened, and then we'll dive into sort of some of the learnings from it and what we think, could have been done better or maybe differently. Okay, so the Intuit CEO had an interview set up with Dakota, which is part of the Verge, and it was a long form interview, I would say. They were going to cover a bunch of different topics, and what happened basically is they did the interview. The journalist felt like the interview went really well. As part of the interview, not the whole interview, but as a portion of the interview, they asked about an area that I guess is a bit contentious for Intuit. So Intuit, for those that don't know, they have a whole bunch of products, but a large portion of their products are around doing your taxes, so tax software. And there's a big debate in the US at the moment, and Katie, you probably know more about this, but I've done a little bit of reading on it around some of this software and the fact that it's paid, and there is a big discussion around tax filing in the US and making it a lot easier for people, making it free for people who don't have a complicated tax environment. I think I read as part of the Dakota article, the journalist says the US is one of the most complicated tax filing systems as part of the Western world. So yeah. Intuit obviously sells product that people pay to use their software to do their taxes. And they've got into a little bit of trouble in the past where they've sort of advertised a product as a free tax product. And then as people go to do it, they sort of redirect them to different parts of the product, and then it ends up being a paid product. So they've found themselves in a bit of trouble there in terms of the marketing around that. They've also been lobbying the government quite heavily around kind of not pushing people down this path of just being able to file their taxes through the government directly for free without using any software, which you can understand why they don't necessarily want that path to happen. That's all in the public domain. That's already happened. They have been lobbying, as we said. That's all in the public domain. There's been reports about it. So, the journalist, as part of this interview, a broad-ranging interview with the CEO of the company, asked about this issue of taxes, about their lobbying work, and kind of the broader issue. And they had a discussion about it in the broader context of the interview. What I think is interesting is the journalist actually said, it's Dakota. We have exchanges like this all the time. I didn't really think anything of it at the time when they were having this discussion. And the journalist felt like the CEO of Intuit, answered the questions. They had a debate. They didn't necessarily agree, and they moved on from it, and they moved on to other parts of the interview. Fast forward to post-interview, the journalist gets an email from the chief comms officer for Intuit, asking them to remove that portion of the interview. And I think as part of that, and we'll get into this, use some language in the email around that part of the interview that the journalist felt was quite unfair and inflammatory around that discussion and how it went down. The flow on from that, of course, you know, every PR person's nightmare is that instead of that, the story being the story became the fact that they were asking Dakota to remove this part of the interview. And there's a big article about it. It then spurred other articles, and it kind of created a news cycle of its own around this idea of like, should that be, is that appropriate? You know, how did it go down and all of that sort of stuff. So that's kind of what happened. I don't know, Boysen, what you thought about all of this when you saw it.
Well, my first thought was thoughts and prayers for Intuit's PR team. Like that was the first thing that I thought. And we've talked about this many times in the past. And when you see a scenario like this as a comms person, you're just like, oh my God, you know. But I honestly think that the first thing that came to my head was what pushed this decision to actually come to life. Like, how did this actually get to the point where the interview, like the PR, the comms person, and this obviously is not a knock. I'm just trying to understand and digest the topic. But the comms team should know that this is coming up or that this could be a possibility. The person doing the interview, the CEO in this instance, should be properly prepped and like ready to understand how to navigate through that conversation. And then also, you have to understand the publication that you're speaking to, right? Like The Verge is a publication that famously doesn't even do interviews on background. Like they are very strict kind of reporting and have integrity, which is nice to see, but also, you know, can also come through in when you try to manipulate a conversation in that way. Manipulating is probably not the right word, but adjust, right?
Yeah.
So the first thing that came to my head was like, what was that decision or that strong internal battle that maybe happened behind the scenes that caused them to say, okay, we've made the call, we're going to ask them to change it. And that's what spun around in my head.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think, you know, like you said, I don't want to throw their comms team under the bus. Like, I think it's really hard sometimes when you're in that position. It does interest me that, you know, this is not a topic that they should not have thought would come up. Like, I do think as a company, it's interesting to me that maybe they did prepare for it. I don't know, but I would have thought they would have in an interview like this with a CEO. I would imagine every interview they go into, that CEO should be prepared for that conversation.
100%.
And it's not an easy one. I totally get that. It's not going to be an easy answer. And I think that's sometimes hard because, you know, ultimately they have a position as a business to protect their business and they're trying to do that. They're doing a lot of lobbying work. I think if you're going to lobby the government, you need to be prepared to be able to talk to your position and be comfortable in what is that position. And that doesn't mean everybody's going to agree with that position and you're going to be liked, but, you know, what is that position? And then once you land on that and what you're comfortable sharing publicly, being able to handle that in the interview. And it's interesting because, like, if you look at the article that they then wrote once they were asked to remove it, he talks about the fact that the email said, you know, there were raised voices and they were speaking over each other.
Right.
I didn't get that impression from the discussion. I think it was heated. And I think, you know, there's how heated is heated. Everybody has a different definition, right? So I thought it was interesting that they went down that path when really, as a CEO, they should be able to answer that and stick to their messaging. And the journalists might not like the messaging. They might disagree. But that shouldn't be something, I think, that they're so worried about that they have to then ask to be removed afterwards. So that was, I guess, the interesting part for me is, were they not prepared? Did the CEO, maybe they were prepared and the CEO went off-piste and it was too far? I didn't think, looking at the transcript and kind of having a listen, I thought the CEO did an okay job, maybe not the best, but I wouldn't have thought it was that bad that it had to be removed from the entire interview.
I agree. I think that, you know, the actual interview was not that bad. Like,
No.
I wouldn't have taken it for like, oh, they really messed up there. That's really off message, or I can't believe that they're talking about that. I think what it signals to me is that with the raised tones that maybe the CEO was feeling, or the PR person being on guard, listening in the room, might have felt as well, is I think that it's a signal of taking the bait that we talked about as well, and so if a journalist starts to use strong language, or they're trying to take you down a road you don't want to go to, instead of bridging away and letting like your ego step aside and really understanding this is a person that's genuinely interested and wants to have a conversation about this topic, the bait got taken, and that's maybe where the reflection after the interview kind of would have gone in that direction of, I didn't like that part because I felt that I was attacked.
And maybe I don't know enough about the issue. Maybe the CEO did say something that was putting them into hot water from a legal perspective. I don't know enough to know that. That was my other thought, is maybe there's something in there that they've got something coming up in court, or who knows, right?
Like the legal or regulatory.
That they genuinely were like,
thing.
oh God, this is going to come back to bite us if this is in the public domain. That's possible. It's interesting though, that if that was the case, personally, I probably would ring the journalist, not email. And I would probably ring and say, listen, we've got this thing coming up, court or regulatory, whatever it might be. And, we really didn't want to go down that path right now. Is it possible if we take that out, but we're happy to do an interview on another day where we can go a little bit more into detail, but at the moment it's really sensitive for us, or something like that, where it's like you're appealing. It's kind of what David Swan said, like they are humans and you're a big company, and I don't think they're out to get you, right? To me, it was interesting that they emailed. Like maybe they couldn't get hold of the journalist, who knows? But for me, that feels really uncomfortable as well. I'm like, that's a conversation. I don't feel like it's a like email directive. And look what happened. I mean, part of that language gets used then, and I think that's part of the danger. But yeah, I mean, maybe we don't know that, but I did think it was interesting how strongly they wanted that thing out of there. So maybe there's something going on.
I think that's a really good lesson of, if you are managing a CEO of that size of a company and they're going to be going on to an interview, particularly a podcast, you better know that journalist well enough to be able to ring them and them to answer your phone call. Like, I think that that's the other lesson is, if there's a sensitive thing, whether it be like legal or regulatory or something that you want to give them some context on, and maybe you can dig in at a later date, putting it on email is like the last thing that you want to do, because it's traceable as well.
Yeah. I think and I think the other thing is, and you kind of touched on it, but I guess I'm shocked that if it was really something they didn't want to talk about, to the point where they had to have it, they wanted it removed afterwards, why would they not just, it's always better to bridge, right? Always better to bridge from it into something else. But if you really can't, and you really don't want to talk about it, and that wasn't what the interview was set up for, let's be clear, like that wouldn't be so I don't understand why the CEO just didn't say, and it's not a good message, but it's kind of like, if you get to the point where it's literally you cannot talk about it, maybe just saying, I'm not here to talk about that issue today. What I'm here to talk about is blah. If you want to have an interview that's specifically about our position on taxes and tax software and the lobbying that we've been doing, we can set that up. But that's not today's purpose. And be really strong with the journalist. I mean, that isn't the purpose of the interview. Again, I go back to, they should still be able to answer this because it's part of their business, and but if you really couldn't, I don't understand, like, why not just shut it down versus what they've ended up in now, which is we need to remove it. It just, But again, that could be the CEO panic, like you said, took the bait, went off script, and then had a panic at the office afterwards.
Yeah, I just wonder, what that conversation was like with the CEO and the comms person as well, because we've all been in that scenario where maybe the the executive that did the interview hated the headline, thought it was sensational, or thought the quote was out of context that was in their article. And it's really on the comms person to, one, either read into it like you're actually a reader and try to understand, like, is this the right like thing to do? Is this the right fit for the article? 2, think about, how do I need to protect the company? Have I hurt the company in this scenario? Will this article hurt the company? And then also think about, you know, the journalist that you're speaking with, and what the context is there, the relationship you have. And I think there's a big question around, when is it right to ask to amend the article and when is it not right?
Yeah. It's a hard one because I'm kind of the firm belief, like, if you say it, they have a right to print it. That doesn't make it comfortable, but that's something you really need to work with your executives on. And it's funny because I do think in different markets, there's different, like, we don't do a lot of on background in Australia. We can do it. But there's certain media I just would never do it with because I just don't believe they would honor that. It's not always a system that's honored, I would say.
Yeah.
So, when I started doing more work with people in the US, and they'd say, "Oh, just do that on background with that journalist." And I'd be like, "Oh, no, that won't work. And whatever is said could still be quoted." Right. But if you have the right relationship with some of the journalists, of course you can do stuff on background. But again, to your point, it comes back to, like, do you know that journalist well enough that you can say, "Listen, I'm happy to give you all this because it gives you context. It helps you understand the issue. But actually that's just on background and we're not going to, go into detail." I think you just have to really understand the publication, the journalist, all of those things really deeply if you're going to go down that path. Otherwise, assume it can be printed if you say it. From my perspective, then what can you amend? You can amend facts that are wrong.
Names that are misspelled.
Names, anything like that. Even if it's like a quote taken out of, like, a part of a quote, I think that's, sometimes unfair. And that's partly why, if you can record or really have really good transcripts or anything like that, notes from your interviews. Because I have had that happen before where a journalist will take a portion of a quote, but the full quote actually gives a better perspective and they didn't want that. I do think that's a little unfair, and I'm happy to have a conversation with a journalist about that to say, "Hey, you've kind of cut that quote in half, and the second half had a caveat to it, or something like that."
Yeah.
Other than that, I'm of the belief you have to push back pretty hard on your execs.
I agree. If I'm asked to amend an article, the first thing I do is ask a bunch of questions back. Like, what is making you feel strange about this particular piece? Is there something that I need to understand from a business standpoint that this is going to impact?
Yeah.
What does this mean for our relationship with the journalist moving forward? Like that kind of thing is what swirls in my head, and that I will work through with the executive so that they can understand also the position that, one, they're putting us in by having to go back as comms people. But 2, also understanding the impact of what could be what's happened to Intuit as well, where the story is no longer even the story, where it could have just run and it would have gotten a quarter of the eyeballs or earballs because it was a podcast, but like, and it could have been, out the door and not a huge thing. So I think also keeping your cool and really in context, realizing what is this article and could it be something else is important.
I think, and you said it before, but that idea of, like, read it as a reader or as a customer, or, not as someone who's in the bubble, because in the bubble things can seem really bad. And then someone else reads it. And I've had an example where we did a piece of work with a customer, and this was back when I was at Salesforce, and I won't name the customer, but the headline I thought was a bit controversial, I thought, or a little bit strong against the customer. And I was really kind of upset, and I was like, "Oh, I wonder if I can ring the journo. Like, I don't really feel like that's fair." And we would be the ones obviously pushing for the interview because it was a customer. But before I did anything, I picked up the phone to the comms person at the customer. And I was like, "Hey, the article's out. I thought these bits were good." And I kind of was like, "Oh, I'm not sure about the headline." And as soon as I said that, they were like, "Yeah, we're fine. We think it's fine." Because in their context, they were used to being quite hounded by the media. So to them, it wasn't a harsh headline. But for us, we weren't always used to that type of... And so it was just a really good learning of like, what is controversial to you is not necessarily, and that was an example of a customer, but same thing for the reader. Like maybe Intuit's customers wouldn't just have glanced over that bit and not even, and now it looks like they're shady. It looks like they're trying to hide something. Like there's all this flow on, when I think you're right, in the eyes of a reader, maybe that wouldn't have even been that noticeable.
So we've talked about kind of how do you manage and amend, but I also want to talk about how you prep your executive for a meeting or an interview like this. Particularly when you're speaking to somebody like The Verge, where you know you're going to get what you get. And they tend to ask tough questions, and you're talking about a big, tough topic, you know?
Yeah.
So I think that's what I think would be helpful for people to kind of hear a little bit as well of how we've done that in the past.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's kind of what do we want to get out of this interview? So you do all that bit, right? What are our key messages? What are we, why are we doing this interview in the first place, right? And there would have been a key thing that they were pushing as part of that. So you do that. Then what we used to kind of do, and, I think is a good exercise, is sort of issues mapping, I guess. So what are the issues internally that might come up that we know we've been called out on before? But then it might be what's in the external domain that might come up. And, if like there's so many examples of CEOs stuffing up lately. But, Woolworths going into an interview, it's like they 100% should know cost of living is going to come up. Price gouging is going to come up. So let's prepare responses for all of these things. And so kind of that issues mapping of what's going on in the external world. What do we know is an issue internally that may pop up, that someone might have leaked, someone might have said something. Just having that kind of really robust sense of where it could go. And if it never goes there, great. But why would you not be prepared for those areas? And then I think pressure testing and role playing is really, really important, particularly at this, like we're talking CEO level interviews, right?
Yeah.
I would be doing prep interviews. I would be doing role plays, okay, I'm playing journalist. I'm going to go hard on the tax issue. Let's practice. I'm going to go hard on the people issue. If there's a people issue in the, in like any of that, I think that role play is more helpful than just reading a document for the CEO. I think the more you can encourage your executives, and I know they don't often love to do this, but I do think that role play really helps, because I love playing a hard journalist. I think it's a really good thing to do, because the harder you are, they're probably not going to be as hard, right? So if you go really hard and pressure test all of those areas as a CEO, that I think that's the best way to kind of really feel out how you're going to handle tough stuff. But a lot of execs don't put the time aside to do that. So, shout out to execs who listen to this, put the time aside.
Well, in that same vein, I think there's two different types of execs that I've run into. There's ones that want to know the whole picture and are asking questions in your prep session of, if the topic is on AI, they're like, well, what's this journalist's view on AI? Do they like it? Do they find it dangerous? Like, what does that look like? Like they kind of come with already an idea of where the car could crash. And you not only get to prep for anything in your peripherals, but also what you actually want to frame them up and talk about for the interview. I think there's the other executive where they want you to come in and tell them what they want to say, and they think the interview has to go down this road because that's what the interview is. And so I would always say, I would always advise a comms person or a comms team to always prep for the bigger picture and the peripherals. Like, don't go into that interview prep and say, here's what we think the questions are going to be. Here's the purpose of the topic. Here's the last 3 articles that the journalist has written about this topic. That's not a good way to prep your exec. It's like, here's what everyone is saying around. Here's like a Gartner report that just came out about AI. Like, there's a lot of skepticism. This journalist seems to be, pretty in the middle, but what we can expect is questions around XYZ related to your product, or XYZ related to the industry and your customers, or government regulation coming out. Like, what are you reading right now, executive, that you might see is coming up? Like, have an engaging conversation with them that really wraps not just your story up so that they can deliver it, but really get their head around, like, this is the scenario in the market and the conversation happening around it.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, and this is almost separate to individual interview prep, but is your executive good at just fielding absolute random stuff that they don't want to go into?
Yeah.
And I think
Preach.
that coaching around, like, just because the question is asked does not mean you have to answer it. And I've had examples where literally on the day of an interview, the journalist, something's in the news that's loosely related, and the journalist brings it up, and you won't always have read the news that morning, or you won't, or maybe it's so loosely related that you didn't prep for it. You have to be able to handle those things. And so that would be my other thing of practicing, is like, if there is a left of field that you didn't expect, that you're not read up on. And a good example is like regulation. Like, what do you
Yeah.
think of the announcement that there's going to be a new blah, blah law or whatever it might be? If you don't know, don't answer, because then you're talking about like new regulations and new laws that you are not read up on. And so I think the better thing to say is, wow, that's really interesting. I haven't read up on that. I will go away and do that. I'm really interested to see what that's all about. But our overall feeling around safety is blah. If it's about, I don't know, online safety, something like that. I just think being able to take a question, respond with interest, but not necessarily respond with an opinion if you're not across what it is about.
Yeah. I think having the awareness to say, I don't know, or not right now,
Yeah.
is really powerful.
Yeah.
But it shows a level of vulnerability that sometimes you just don't get from executives. So you need to train them around it.
Yeah. Especially when it's something maybe they should know, or it's close to what they should know. I think that's all. And I think this all applies, like, there's the local market, but if you're doing an interview in a market you don't come from, that can be a really one of those areas where things come up where you're not deep in what the government says about X, Y, Z. And again, hopefully that's in your prep, but it's not always going to be. So you need to be able to get out of these situations if you're in the interview.
Yeah. I think another part of your prep as a comms person is how you prep the journalist as well.
Yep.
So like, if you know that you have an executive who is a bit rigid, or, is the latter of the example of where they want to just stick to the story, instead of scaring your executive, in overthinking and all this practice, how are we also working with the journalists, not to shape their story, but just to understand where their head's at?
Yeah.
Like, if you're having an interview that you've set up with your CEO, you better damn know that journalist well enough to call them up and just say, like, what are you thinking? Like, how long do you think it's going to be? Like, do you want to record it? And even just by asking those basic questions, it will open up the conversation of like, is there anything that's top of mind for you right now? Is there, just shooting the shit around like, oh, did you see that article the other day? That's so funny. What did you think about that? Like, that's interesting. Like, try to get a sense for what the journalist is thinking going into that interview.
Yeah, I agree. Yep. I think, especially like we said, there's kind of levels of interviews. I think if your CEO is doing an interview, like, you got to really know why you're doing the interview. What's the purpose of the interview? Everything about that journo. What have they been writing lately? Go and listen and or read, like David said, the last 10 articles, all of that stuff I think is really important. And then equally important for other execs, but I think the stakes are obviously much higher when you're at the top of the business, because I think there's a little bit of wiggle room if you're not, to be able to say, hey, that's not really my area, or, and have some non-accountability if there's tricky stuff. But as a CEO, the buck stops with you. So, yeah.
Do you think that it's the PR person's fault for a bad result like this?
No, I don't. I think it is an overall comment on the business. And I think that's what people need to realize is, at the end of the day, that comms person is trying to protect the CEO and the business. That's their job. Do I think they did it in the best way possible? No. But I don't know all the details.
Right.
But from what I can see and read, which we know is not necessarily the full story, what I can see and read, I think there would have been a better way to do it. I probably wouldn't have used some of the language that was used in the email. I probably wouldn't have emailed. I think, if you're going to ask for that, I think there has to be some humility around why, and even down to like saying the CEO feels really embarrassed, or the CEO feels like, and you can have that conversation with a journalist off, not on email, right? To say, hey, like I'm calling in a favor. And they still don't have to do it. And you can say that to them. I know you don't have to do this. I know it's not the style of Dakota. I know that's not what you do. I'm calling you as a professional courtesy because this is the position I'm in as a comms person. And if they don't do it, they don't do it. But I don't think that would have ended up with the article. I think the article stems from this mismatch of like them going quite hard on this was bad and you need to remove it. And the journalist being like, I didn't think it was that bad, you know?
I also think there's an opportunity, and maybe, I mean, who knows what was in that email word for word, but I mean, I would have called that journalist and felt it out first. Like, I would have called them and been like,
how do you think the tax conversation went?
I honestly would have just been like, thank you so much. Like, I had so much fun. I was listening in on the line. Was there anything that perked your ears? You know, I think that like you could almost work your way into that conversation by just being grateful for the opportunity as well and thanking them, and then starting to feel it out and say, listen, there's a couple of pieces that maybe we would love to review if you're thinking about publishing the entire article in itself. Here's what they are. Here's why we're feeling a little bit uncertain about it.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's your choice. We would love to, you know, but we would love to have that conversation and like put the power in their hands and just thank you. Just be a mate about it, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So yeah, do I blame the comms person? No. Do I think there's probably nuance that we don't know? Absolutely. I think there's a lot to it, but I do think it's an interesting conversation around this whole area. I do think people think, you know, this idea of the spin doctor, PR people trying to censor things, like I think it doesn't look great. I think the flip of that, and it's been an interesting trend, I have felt in the past that there's this sense that journalists should just do what we want them to do and not ask tough questions. And I'm a big believer in free press. I'm a big believer that business has to be held accountable, whether you work for that business or not, right? And I think we can get into our bubbles when we work for a company and think that we shouldn't be asked tough questions, or journalists shouldn't do that because it wasn't about that. And it's like, they are journalists. That's their job.
Yep.
And we don't have to answer it. We don't have to be part of it. We can bridge away. We can do all the things in our toolkit. But, you know, sometimes you get off an interview and execs are really riled up that a journalist dared to ask it. And it's like, I don't know. That's the attitude that I get really upset about, because I'm like, we're using the media for our gain. But they are there for their audience, right? They're not there for us. That's not their job, is to make, you know. And so I do think that's a trend that I'm seeing a bit of, like, why don't they just toe the line and ask us what they're supposed to ask us? It's like, no, that's not how the dynamic works. If you want a free press and you want a democracy and you want, you know, press that can write what they need to write for their audience.
I totally agree with that point. I also wonder, and this is something that I've been dabbling with a little bit with my clients as well, of, you know, could it have been an opportunity for the CEO to reach out to the journalist? Like, not everything has to be in the PR person's control. Like, could the CEO just have rang and had a really honest conversation? For sure. Put it on fucking speakerphone. Let me listen to your conversation.
I mean, don't shut us out entirely.
You need me still. But I mean, like, would it have meant more, and would it have been a better result if you could have just armed the CEO to then reach out and have that thankful, loved the conversation. Here's where I'm feeling a little bit weird. What did you think? Like, I almost feel like that is a strategy that is sometimes overlooked. Well, that wraps us up for today. You guys, if you have a topic you want us to cover, reach out. We are at hello@smartinpublicpod.com. We're on Instagram and TikTok at smartinpublicpod. But otherwise, we'll chat to you next week. Okay, bye.
Bye.